All right, well, I'll go ahead and get started. So today's topic, it's all about the soil, the impacts on private wells and on-site wastewater systems. Please feel free to use the chat to share where you are joining us from if you didn't hear me right at the beginning. My name is Nicole Dutra. I'm a Senior Project Coordinator here at the National Environmental Health Association and the Private Water Network Administrator. I will be your moderator today. So this seminar is being recorded and the link will be made available to all of you. I'll probably send it out to everyone in an email. Throughout the webinar, please use the Q&A box if you have any questions that you would like to ask our expert today. And without further delay, please allow me to introduce our guest expert, Craig Paul, who has been the Assistant Director of Environmental Health at Placer County in California for the past 2 years. Craig is a Soil Science Society of America certified professional soil scientist and a registered environmental health specialist through NEHA. He has 19 years experience in on-site wastewater and private wells. He spent 3 years as a private consultant in North Central Virginia, performing soil and site evaluations, inspections, and troubleshooting for on-site wastewater systems. He also spent 14 years at the South Central Public Health District in Idaho as an environmental health specialist, land program manager, and environmental health director. So let me close my screen and hello, Craig. So we'll go ahead and get started. So thank you to all of you who responded to the Microsoft form and provided some details about the challenges or issues that you're facing in your jurisdictions and provided questions for today's call. So our first question came from Karen Solberg in Montana. She said the challenges that they're facing deal with high groundwater, bedrock, available physical distance from well and wastewater systems. And her question today was, what treatment systems negate physical distance from groundwater, bedrock, or separation between wells and wastewater systems?
So that's really a good question. And what we have to decide when you're looking at that is what is your goal? What is it you're attempting to accomplish? Because we know there's a lot of components in wastewater that are potentially concerned, but all of them are going to behave differently. So if you're concerned about nitrate, there are a lot of nitrate NSF and ANSI 245 approved systems that'll reduce nitrate very well. If you're more concerned about bacteria or viruses, then that's where the NSF ANSI standard 40 would come in. Those sort of systems will do a good job of taking care of those. If you're concerned about other things like emerging threats like pharmaceuticals or PFAS or that sort of thing, that can be a different story. Some of those cannot, at least under today's technology, be adequately really taken care of in a wastewater treatment system. That's just the reality of the technology today. We're working on more, I'm sure, but that right now, that's difficult. A basic line, though, anything that's going to add time to your treatment, recirculation or that sort of a thing, or is going to add oxygen to the treatment because that changes your microbial population from anaerobic to aerobic, and aerobic microbes are usually far more efficient at changing stuff that we don't want to have into stuff that isn't so bad. Anything like that is going to do better than not. And when we're trying to compensate for a lack of soil, because those soil processes are really what we rely on to remediate effluent, those are your options really is get more recirculation, get oxygen into the system. And the NSF ANSI standards are, I think, personally, I think they're pretty good for that sort of thing.
Great, thank you, Craig. And our next question came from Lori Badigian, sorry if I messed up your name, in Idaho. Her challenges were setbacks and being able to answer people. For example, if the well is downslope from the septic system, is that a problem? And where does the 100-foot separation distance rule come from?
So, and this is an interesting question, and so for the purposes of our discussions at our level, and maybe for the public if they're interested in this level of information, we don't really care about upslope or downslope. What we really care about is up gradient and down gradient. Now, oftentimes they're the same thing, especially if you take a big enough area. Obviously, water is going to flow downhill, but in some cases it can flow uphill. That's why we get artesian wells. So that's why we talk about gradients rather than uphill, downhill. Now, the reality to that is all water is going to run downhill, down gradient, from higher pressure to lower pressure. That's the way it is. But if the well is properly constructed and you've got your proper vertical and horizontal setbacks, then no, that's not going to be a problem, because that's why we have those construction standards. That's why we have setbacks or separation distances and rule, is so that water, the effluent is going to turn into clean water by the time it hits a well. And you got to remember that everybody's downhill with somebody. Unless you're really up the top of the mountain, everybody's going to have something uphill or up gradient. So that's where I'd handle that one. As for the 100 separation distance rule, honestly, a number was picked. We all understand that you need some sort of a distance, but back in the way old days before I was even born, they kind of just came up with 100 feet. Some states have more have a wider distance required. Some have less. Sometimes 100 feet is more than you need. Sometimes it's not enough. That's just the reality. But 100 feet was basically just a number that was picked. And really the goal is to make the separation sufficient for most instances. We're looking at making sure we have enough safety margins. We're making sure that we're not going to lose beneficial uses of surface water or groundwater. It's not realistic to test these. There are ways to test exactly how far it needs to be, but that's not realistic in most cases. And so we just kind of picked a number and went with 100 feet. And like I said, some places are higher, some are lower, but that's the answer to that one.
Thank you, Craig, for that. Our next question comes from Angela DeNovi in Tennessee. She stated that our biggest challenge is that we require a state-certified soil scientist to do soil maps for all of our new septic applications, but we have extremely limited soil scientists, like one in training. Angela shared 3 questions today. What should we be considering regarding soils when we are evaluating a site for a private well?
So first of all, to address your problem, yeah, that's actually there's a lot of places around the country that are having that issue, regardless of the system they set up. There's just not enough people doing this work, and that's a much bigger deal that we as an industry need to figure out how we can get people to understand that, 1, this is a career, 2, it's a good career. We just need to get ourselves out there. So that's my little soapbox. I'll get off my soapbox now. Now, to answer your question, what do you do regarding soils when you're evaluating a site for private well? So remember that soil is your first line of defense, always, against groundwater contamination, surface water contamination. Soil really does a very good job of cleaning things that we don't want in water out of the water. It really does. But when we're talking about well siting, well construction is probably far more important than any single soil property. The reality is that the well has to be constructed correctly. The grout has to be right. The casing has to be right. It has to be to the right depth. Those have to happen first. But we're talking about soil today, not well construction standards. So avoid places that have ponding. Keep in mind that grouting is, the way I look at it, is it's more water resistant than it is waterproof. So you put water ponding on top, water's going to find its way down. And it may find around the grout, but it's going to find its way down. So avoid anywhere that's going to have any sort of ponding water. Don't put a well there. Also, saturated soil is not nearly as effective at removing contaminants than unsaturated soil. So the longer the water stays, the soil stays saturated, it's just not doing the job we want it to in terms of cleaning out contaminants. Another thing you want to avoid is anywhere where the soils are too loose, because that's also going to create preferential pathways. It's going to create settling problems. You can compensate with that for more grout, deeper casing, sort of a thing. But you want to avoid places where there's large cracks, preferential flow. Again, that's bypassing those soil processes and water just going straight down. Avoid uncompacted fill. Just don't do it there. It's just going to cause you problems. Either compact the fill or just find a different spot. You do actually, ironically, in contrast to what we're looking for on-site wastewater for a well, you actually do want soils that are pretty tight, don't allow a lot of water movement. That's actually better for your well location. You're going to increase your chances of having contaminants removed before you get down there, before it gets down to the water table and you're actually sucking the water back up. And remember that when you're doing a well, essentially what you're doing is you're punching a hole through all those protective layers. And we try to compensate with that by casing and by grouting, but that's the reality. So when you're going to punch a hole through things, remember that we're trying to seal it back up, but the more chances you can make sure that there's not surface water getting down, the better protected that well in the groundwater.
All right. And Angela's next question was, what should we be telling homeowners about their property soil and land use to protect their well?
So this is an interesting one. So whenever I'm dealing with property owners, I like to think in terms of teachable moments. And the reality is you can tell them all the you want, you can give them all the information, this wonderful information, but if they're not in a frame of mind to listen and understand, it doesn't matter. And so take advantage of teachable moments and don't overdo it. Most people have a certain amount of attention span. Get what you can in when you can, and then accept that you may not be able to get everything you want to. Now, when I'm talking to people about water, about protecting their private well, I try to help them to understand that you right now are your own water treatment operator. You have your own water treatment plant. You're the operator. You're the one who makes sure that your water stays clean. So how do you do that? Well, don't have any standing water around, because water on the surface is not what unless you want to go take a cup out of that pond that's your well's in the middle of and drink that. Don't do it. Don't make your soil so that you're not going to have water sitting over the top of your well. Make sure that there aren't any entry points. One of the big ones is electrical conduits. You know, that plastic pipe, they put all those electric wires on. Well, if those aren't covered on both ends, you can get stuff down inside of there. And you don't want to know some of the things that we found in wells that crawled in through those little pipes and got into the well. Just make sure it's all capped off. Make sure there's not entry points into that well, because bugs and amphibians, they will find them. Make sure there aren't any dead end lines. That's a big one. As people do remodels and stuff, dead end lines are just a breeding source for bacteria. You can have the best water in the world in your well, but if it comes up and hits a dead end line and it kind of circles around and just mixes up, you're going to have problems in your system. Make sure you're not back siphoning. Most places that are on a public water system have laws to make sure that you don't get back siphoning. For the most part, that's not an issue on a private well, but it could be an issue. You can, if you hook up one of those, I can't remember the brand name, but there's those little, they're a fertilizer that you hook up to your hose, and it's just a little box of fertilizer, and then it sprays out the end. The water goes into that fertilizer. If your well goes out at the wrong spot, wrong moment, you can suck that fertilizer right back into your system. So avoid back siphoning. That's why those air release valves on the top of faucets exist. Don't build anything too close to your well. Don't park vehicles near the well. You can have the best vehicle in the world, but it might drip some grease. You don't want that in there. And the biggest thing I found in my entire career is people who have their well and then they build this nice well house over the top and it looks all pretty, and then they realize, hey, I can store things in there. Just don't store things in your well house. If you wouldn't want to drink it, don't put it in the well house. That's one of those things that people do it all the time, and I get why they do it, but it's just a really bad idea. And then also the final thing, and if you can get nothing else through them, if you only have a fraction of a moment to teach them, if that teachable moment is tiny, tell them to test their well regularly, because that's going to tell them if there's an issue. Even if they're the most perfect and most conscientious person, remember, so everybody's got somebody upstream, and the person upstream may not be. So they really ought to be testing their well regularly. Their water, not the well, the water from the well.
Great. Thank you, Craig. That's great advice. What special considerations do you have for well protection for like row crop agriculture and well protection?
Everything I just said. Keep it far enough away, avoid the chemicals, and in particular, keep livestock away from them. You didn't ask specifically about livestock, but livestock and wells don't mix.
Great. Next question is from Megan Spry from Montana. The issue was well drillers allowing customers to drill their well below their septic drain field, mixing zones encroaching on the neighboring well isolation zones with no regard to soil type and how fast groundwater moves through the soil. Level 2 systems in place of conventional septic systems, and understanding the importance of why on small lots where the well isolation zone has to be violated. First question was how to present a variance for well isolation zone encroachment to someone who really knows nothing about it.
So I don't have personal experience with this, so I'm going to answer the question the best I can. If I'm misunderstanding your question, by all means, get my contact information. We can talk later. But the way I think I'm understanding your question is, the way I would talk to somebody about it is to help them understand why a variance is needed or why it's okay, is to look at screens. You have a screen on your window. One screen is going to keep out big bugs. It's not going to keep out gnats. And if a deer decides to charge through your screen, it's not going to keep a deer out. But if you start adding screens, then you're going to screen out more of the little things and more of the big things. It just gets harder for it to go through. And so that's what we do with the soil. We're making sure there's enough screens between the source of whatever you want to keep out and where you're taking it in that it will clean things out. Every time we set a setback and rule, though, we put in safety margins because we know we don't understand everything and every situation is different. We understand safety margins. We put in more screens than we probably need. But a variance, you're taking away those screens. The key is to make sure you take away not too many, that it's still safe. And that's the way I would explain it to somebody is just using the screen example.
Great. Megan's next question was how do you determine the best distance from a well based on soil type and mixing zone?
The best way is hydrologic modeling with dye. That's not realistic though. That's just economically, it's just not going to happen. And so the best answer I can give you, and I read a little bit on Montana's rules so I could kind of get some background from this. They've got a pretty good start. Really, you pick the contaminant you're most concerned about. Usually we use nitrate because it's the one that's most readily movable and it's really easy to test for and deal with. And you do some modeling and you see if you can, you just base this soil. We think we have this soil. We have this much water in our groundwater. It's moving this fast. This is our best model and you come up with it. Montana actually has a pretty decent setup from what I understand. But by all means, again, if we have more, if I'm not getting the question, please let's talk later on offline maybe or later on here if we have time. Sometimes, as much as we don't like to say it out loud, the solution to pollution is dilution. It's just the reality of the work we do.
Absolutely. Thank you, Craig. The next, it was a comment from Joelle Worth in Arizona. She wrote that setbacks from wells changed over the years, making it difficult for those with both wells and septic systems to add additional flows to their systems. And Craig wanted to provide some input on that for you, Joelle.
And I'll try and make it quick. I'm not going to cover everything as, you know, we're trying to make sure we get all through all this. But the answer to that one is yes, it's just difficult. And sometimes things just cannot be done safely. That's just the honest truth. But we also have to recognize that we live in a world where we have to make some compromises sometimes. So the reality is that if possible, if you can do some sort of grandfathering, make exceptions for people who did things under the previous rules to allow things to happen, that's great. But the real answer, the real, you know, where we want to get to is, I'm sorry, not all properties are created equal. And that's just the way it is.
All right, thank you. Next is from Amanda Roberts in Kansas. She wrote, restrictive layers in the soil very close to the top of the ground and system choices for those, ground contamination issues, and dealing with the state on those cases. How do you effectively deal with ground contamination issues for private wells?
Well, if you can figure out the best answer for that, then you will win a Pulitzer Prize, or not a Pulitzer, a Nobel Prize, I'm sure. That is something that every state, every county, every city is dealing with to some struggle, to some extent. Nobody's figured out the answer. Well, we know the answer, but it's a very political and emotional subject. And whenever you throw politics and emotions into it, it just becomes difficult to deal with. And so the best way I would suggest is understand that you're dealing with politics and emotion. Don't deal with science unless you can deal with the politics and emotion first. If you can resolve those, then you can move on to data and science. But if you can't resolve politics and emotion, good luck. That's all I can tell you.
All right, thank you. Next, we had a comment and question from Jennifer Luperel in Montana. She wrote, there is concern of approving shared wells in bedrock aquifers where there are no nearby wells. And her question was high nitrates and how to accurately predict attenuation.
So with your comment, I share concerns about that. Shared wells are, in my opinion, probably your last option, but I recognize that sometimes you have to do that last option. As for nitrates, this is something that's really being worked on heavily. It has been for the past few decades all over the world. I don't think we're quite there yet with a really good, robust modeling or anything like that to predict nitrate attenuation. But we have the advantage of that farming also cares about nitrate attenuation because they're paying to put nitrate on fields. So they really want to know what happens when nitrate goes into the ground. And so there's a lot of money from the agriculture side of this that we can probably use some of that research to inform us in our decisions. So anyway, the answer to that is we're getting better. I don't know that there is a single way right now that I would say to predict. Soil texture can kind of tell you, but I think the answer to there is stay tuned. I think we'll have a good answer. I think before well, I got about 20 years left before I retire. Before I retire, I'll bet the answer will be we'll have something.
Great. Our next question came from Daphne Dunn in California. I'm concerned about the potential impact of agricultural water mining on surrounding private wells. What are some methods of protecting private well water quantity and quality?
So this is a really hard question, and not from a technical standpoint. From a technical standpoint, we understand everything we need to do. Enforce the existing well construction wells, well construction rules that every state already has. Enforce quantity because every state has you can only pull this much water out, and enforce environmental regulations. And then continue appropriately reacting as things come out new, like PFAS and that sort of thing. The problem with this is, as I alluded before, politics and emotions and livelihoods, money. That's where this becomes difficult. The technical standpoint, we know what to do, but overcoming those hurdles, because we're human and emotions ultimately rule for the most part, that's where it's difficult. The answer to that is we need to be working as a group, and we need to be getting allies and other groups. We probably need to have a complete overhaul of the way water rights are handled in the United States. That's the reality. That one may not happen in my career before I retire, but that's the reality of where we need to go. We also need to be working on reuse, but we can't just say reuse is the answer because we also have to be working on technologies to handle those higher concentrations of wastewaters. Because as you reuse the water, you're just concentrating the waste, and then you end up with concentrated waste, and you can't just deal with that the same way. So we've got to work on those two at the same time. I hate to say it, but we may have to look at rebalancing populations into areas that have more water. I'm going to leave it at that. I'm not going to go any further there.
All right. Our next question came from Lisa Chang in Virginia. Her concern was around PFAS testing and asked, are there labs to cover private PFAS testing needs?
So for that one, I would check with your local state agency that approves water testing labs. EPA now has two methods that are approved, 533 and 537.1. The real answer to that is there may not be any in your state. You may have to go to another state because those are relatively new. This is a new emerging thing. There are actually not that many test labs that are certified for it. I think the last time I looked, there were only 10 or 15 states that had a lab in their state. So I think as time goes on, we will get more capacity, but right now you may be looking at mailing to another state.
Got it. All right, next question is from Alice Quinn in Indiana. She wrote, close proximity of wells to on-site sewage systems, untreated sewage discharging to waterways, and on-site sewage system and well density. Those are the issues that she's facing. And her question is, has there been any study done to show how far sewage will or can travel in a large body of water? If there are several homes that discharge sewage to a stream or river, what is the likelihood of contamination of wells in the area?
So the answer to that question is yes and no. When we deal with contamination, when we're dealing with contamination in water, we don't deal with distance, we deal with time. When we're dealing with, when we're dealing with the fate of contaminants in water, you're talking about time, not distance. And again, it comes down to what are we concerned about? There have been studies done about how long, say, E. coli will last in water. In fact, there was one about 10 years ago where they found out that if the E. coli gets into the sediment, it can be there for months under the right conditions. So yay for us. So some contaminants are going to be stable. They'll be there forever. Some contaminants won't be. They'll go away just pretty quickly. And it really depends on what kind of water body you're talking about. Is it fast running? What's the temperature? What's the pH? What are the other factors of that water and how quickly it's going to be remediated? So yes, there are studies. There's a lot of them out there, but none of them are going to be telling you how far they'll travel. They'll all tell you how long they last. Obviously, turbulent water usually takes care of things faster, but it also sends it downstream. As for a lot of homes that are discharging into a stream or river with likelihood of contamination, that depends on, is it a gaining stream or a losing stream? Because if it's a gaining stream, that means the water is coming from outside of the stream into the stream. So your chances of contamination are pretty slim because the water is running from your well towards the stream. But if it's a losing stream, then the water is running from the stream into the groundwater. Then you could have a potential issue. And you got to remember, some streams are losing during part of the year and gaining during part of the year. It's not necessarily all the time. And so that's really what's the likelihood? It depends on your specific conditions in that particular area. I personally would be concerned, unless you know for sure that it is always a gaining body of water, I would be concerned with that. And I would run treated sewage into a water bottle. I would be concerned.
Okay. Thank you, Greg. Next comment and question came from Matt Even in Iowa. He wrote, one challenge that I've encountered is handling the discharge of treated affluent from an alternative system in relation to the separation distance from a well. The state has recently clarified that treated affluent may be discharged to the surface of the ground with no minimum separation distance from a well, but if you discharge treated affluent into a trench that daylights on the end for the sole reason of reducing the amount of effluent discharged to the surface, you have to meet all separation distances. The question is, do the conditions on the surface substantiate there not being a minimum separation distance from wells for the discharge of treated affluent, like those required when discharging into shallow soils?
I cannot think of a single scientific reason why those two situations would be handled differently. I suspect that was a politics-driven decision rather than a science vision. I don't know. That's my suspicion.
All right, thank you. Next, we have Megan Bullock in Montana. Her issue was premature failure due to clay soils. What are the best options for drain fields and soils that have an application rate of 0.15 to 0.3 GPD per square foot? Currently, I advise installers to rake sidewalls and trench bottoms, use smaller doses more frequently to allow the soils to swell gradually, discharge brine from water softeners elsewhere, and install systems at shallower depths to allow more evaporation, but systems are still failing quickly. What else can be done? Is there any option other than an ETA or ET system?
So you're on the right path. When you're dealing with really tight clays, the answer is you've got to spread the water out either by over time and by area. But there's realistic limits to what we can do. There's only 24 hours in a day. We can't spread it any further than that. and property sizes are property sizes, and sometimes there are limits. So you're on the right track. You probably ought to do it, but drip might help. A lot of pre-treatment can sometimes help that a little bit. If it's okay and acceptable in the area, you could do pre-treatment and then some sort of surface discharge. You just bypass the soil completely, whether into a water body or a sprinkler or a lagoon or something. You really have to just increase your long-term acceptance rate to the maximum you can, and realizing that it may not be possible. The reality is, and you could try wetlands also. It's just a variation on a ET system, but you could try it in wetlands. It's sometimes people handle it better because it's a wetland, not an ET system. But the reality is, in this instance, as somebody mentioned in the comments earlier, the reality is sometimes there just isn't a way. Lots are not all created equal. Some lots just cannot be built on. And we really need to shift our focus. And this isn't going to help lots that are already existing, but if we're creating lots, we really need to be putting into place the legal ability to stop lot creation in areas that just can't handle on-site wastewater. On-site wastewater is a great tool. I love it, but there are some places it's just not right for that location.
Got it. Thank you. Megan, I hope that answered your question. I saw that you dropped a question also in Q&A, but it looks like it's like the same question. If you could let us know. And we didn't receive any additional questions, but there were some issues that some of you shared. Jason Barrett in Mississippi shared issues with total coliform presence. Amy Bethich in Connecticut asked or made a comment about contamination from PFAS. Laura in Montana and Bree in Minnesota mentioned nitrate levels, contamination, agricultural runoff. Do you have any additional tips or advice you could provide for any of those topics, Craig?
So when you're dealing with contamination in groundwater, what we have to focus on as an industry is strengthening the ability to keep contamination out of groundwater, because once it gets into groundwater, it is in many cases essentially impossible to remove. It just is. In fact, I've seen a study back when I was in college. I was doing a study, or I looked at a study that found that coliform bacteria, E. coli in particular, once introduced into a groundwater, will live there happily forever. It will never come out. And so we really have to shift our focus to strengthening the ways, like I was saying, those screens. We have to get more screens, and we have to get it so that our industry is elevated to the same level. In my opinion, we need to be looked at as engineers. The same confidence. If an REHS is saying something, that's got as much weight behind it as an engineer. Talk to anybody out there, and they say engineer. Oh, they all understand what that means. They have respect for that. We need to get our industry to that same level so that we can have those dialogues with the engineers, with the policymakers, to help them understand that, look, yes, we all want to have development. We don't want to stop housing. I mean, we're not trying to do that. We're not trying to stop industry, but we have to make sure that we're preventing problems rather than reacting to those problems, because sometimes there's no way to fix the problem once it happens. That'd be my thought there. And I think the things that are going on today because this is going on nationwide, groundwater is getting contaminated, groundwater is going away. This is giving us additional ammunition. This is giving us additional force, I think, behind. We just have to make sure that we can get into those conversations. Remember, engineers, it took them probably about 100 years before all the codes everywhere said, if you want to build, you have to have an engineer. We're at the beginning stages, and it's not we have to keep pushing. We have to keep working. It's not going to happen soon, but we need to follow that same process so that we can get ourselves to that table, because nobody has the same perspective we do. Nobody sees the things we do in the way we do. This is practical science, and there's a gap there that we really can fill. And I think we need to step in, because if we don't, the engineers are going to. And I don't know how many of you worked with engineers, wonderful people, but they see things from one perspective and one perspective only.
Great. I'll just say to everyone that's here with us, if you have a question that you'd like to ask Craig, please go ahead and drop it in Q&A and we'll address it quickly. I was going to say, Craig, how you answered that and provided advice on that and your perspective. I think that kind of falls in line with what Bonnie in Idaho asked about or shared about poor lot planning, especially when the homeowner is doing the work. Property owners may contact the well driller first to get their list. My area only has 6 well drillers. Septic comes next. Building permits are not released until a septic permit has been issued, but oftentimes the property owner has already started work on the lot, removing any usable soil. This is mostly in cases where the homeowner does all the work and does not talk to the professionals in order to save money. So I have a feeling that a lot of what you just said pertains to Bonnie's comment as well. Is there anything additional, any additional advice you could provide on that?
No, other than yes, that happens all the time, nationwide. And I saw it all the time when I was in Idaho. I see it here in California. It happened in Virginia. The answer to that question is, again, we have to get ourselves out there. We have to get people realizing that you're really focused on your granite countertops and your fits and your finishes and having your house. But the only difference between a house and a barn is indoor plumbing. That's the only difference. We have to get people realizing that your wonderful, brilliant house is not going to look really nice with sewage on the floor. You're not going to be happy with it. So let's make sure the sewage doesn't go on your floor. And sometimes they've already messed things up and you can't do anything. All we can do is try and get out there so that we can prevent the next time. And I think this is going to be over time. I think we can work on it. We have to get ourselves so that we are seen as, oh, you got to talk to somebody about electrical. How do I run electrical? How do I get water and wastewater? We have to be one of those first 3. And we're not there yet, but with work, we can get there. Education outreach, like Josh said, education and outreach. We've got to keep hitting that and getting people to understand who we are, what we do, and that we're not their enemy, we're their helper.
Absolutely.
Yep, Bonnie, perfect. Yep.
All right, last call for any questions. Until they run out of it. Isn't that true?
Teachable moments.
Yes.
Sometimes that's what happens when you get your teachable moment.
Yep, absolutely. All right. Well, if there has been a water-related illness found in surface water and they have groundwater access, like a well nearby, what should they do?
If they aren't testing, they should test. Again, that comes down to how safe they are. It's going to depend on how well their well is excluding that surface water. If their well is cased and grouted deep enough that it's excluding the surface water, they're probably fine. If it's not, and if that, like I said, losing and gaining streams, if that water body is a losing water body and it's pushing water towards your well, you could be having issues. So they need to start testing. If they start seeing those things, they're expensive, but you can chlorinate your system, you can UV your system, all the things that all those parasites and bacteria, they will all die to chlorine and to UV. So nobody wants to do it, but those are answers for those particular issues.
Great. Andy Lazur shared, do you have thoughts on how to handle flooding?
So
that's a big question, Andy.
Flooding, right, because when you're dealing with onsite wastewater, what we're doing is we're adding water to the system. And so if the system is already at capacity, if it's already flooded, then us adding water isn't helping anything. So the answer to that is, one, try to avoid the floodplain if you can. Sometimes it's not possible. I get that. I worked in Virginia. Sometimes it's not possible. And so the answer to those are to the property owner is going to have to accept that when it floods, their system isn't going to work very well. Personally, I would do pre-treatment. I would require pre-treatment if the code allows you to. I'd require pre-treatment in that situation, because then you haven't diminished the amount of water going into the system, but you're at least making sure it's cleaner. It's better to be put out into the environment. I would frankly see floodplain systems. My personal preference is, if you have no choice but to put system in a floodplain, that's where surface discharge with pre-treatment and then chlorination, dechlorination, or UV or something like that. That to me, that's the answer, is just deal it as if it's a surface discharge.
Right. Aaron shared a question. Property is in a floodplain. What type of septic system replacements are allowed? Per code currently has a traditional system of septic tank and subsurface gravel filled.
So I think that's the one I just answered, Nicole.
Oh, was it?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry.
And as for your what's allowed in your code, I'm sorry, I don't know your code, so you'd have to look that up. But I think the one from Amanda is new.
She wrote, in our area, we require people to build up their system and anchor their tank.
And if that yes, depending on the nature of the floodplain, if it's relatively slow moving, that'll work just fine. If it's going to be fast moving, that's all going to go away anyway. So yeah, it depends on the nature of the floodplain, but that could be an option. Yes.
All right. Any additional questions? Last call questions? All right, wonderful. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking the time, especially all of you who sent in your comments. Let us know what challenges you are facing in your jurisdiction. And one last comment. If you have not joined the Private Water Network, it is free to join. Please join us. We will have a lot of engagement opportunities and events that we will continue with into the next year. So thank you again for all of you being here with us today. Have a wonderful rest of your day.